Good morning or afternoon almost. First of all, thank you very much for joining me today to talk about new attitudes and behaviours that we are seeing emerging from the current crisis that we're living in. Before I start, there are a couple of things that I want to make you aware of. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes and we'll have 10 to 15 minutes at the end to take questions. My colleague will do that, so Rob, you'll see him in a minute. When you have a question, you can use the chat to post that question in there during the presentation. And essentially, we are recording this session, so that's why your video and your mics are off. And we'll share the recording in the next day or so. So you'll be glad to know that I won't talk too much about COVID-19 in this webinar if like me, you're starting to get a bit tired from hearing about it. So I'll start off. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Experienced Design Director at Fullproof. I've been working at Fullproof for almost 6 years now. I manage a team of strategists, designers and researchers, and I've been working in the field of experience design for over a decade now, and my specialties are ethnography and service and product design. But enough about me. So very briefly about Fullproof. We've been around for about 18 years now, and we've got about 120 people across Europe and Asia. And one of the reasons I've been sticking around at Fullproof is this statement that you see on this screen. It's because we care about what we do and how we do it, and we care about human outcomes. In terms of services that we provide, we do experience strategy, we do design research, we do service design, product design and build, so the full end-to-end. And this is our company's vision and our higher purpose. We aim to improve the lives of millions. So now that you know a little bit about myself and Fullproof, let's move on to what we're here to talk about today. So we are seeing a change in behavior, and that is caused by the pandemic. We've become almost obsessed with hand washing, and we're seeing more and more concerns about touching stuff. We're seeing a level of damaged trust in hygiene, and we have in essence become hyper hygiene conscious. So why do we care at Fullproof? Well, you've seen our vision, and you also know that we design and build services and products. So if hygiene essentially becomes a hygiene factor for public touchpoints, i.e., I mean something that is a basic requirement for interacting with a product, something that is part of the expected standard, then as a community of design practitioners or as owners of products, we're going to have to consider some serious changes to those touchpoints. And when I say public touchpoints, I mean things like, ATMs or self-service checkouts or airport check-in terminals. So essentially, we're seeing the potential for a big impact on service and product design, and so that's why we care. So what do we think is going to happen, but also what are the implications? Well, at a high level, we're going to see hygiene as a significant consideration in design. Spending redirected, bigger focus on touchless technology, and more hacks. So let me take you through our thinking, but also what we did to get there. So here's what we did. We set out to find out where touchless technology is at, what progress has been made in gesture and voice technology, but also dig into the science behind hygiene and germs and public touchpoints at a high level. We also carried out an expert interview with a voice interface design specialist. We wanted to get their point of view on the impact of the pandemic on behaviors, but also understand the viability of other options such as voice and gesture, and see where we are at with these technologies. We had an inkling as well that obviously attitudes towards public-facing technology were changing, so we did a quant survey. And we found out we were onto something. So we did a second quant survey with a larger sample to cast a wider net. And the research that we did into this wasn't commissioned by any of our clients. This was very much led by our R&D squad. So in our research, we uncovered some cues that things were changing, and I'm going to take you through a few examples. So in China, we saw, you may have seen recently that children going back to one school were given homework to create their own social distancing accessory. And this is what they came up with. So they have a 1 meter social distancing rule in that region of the world. And they took inspiration from the Song dynasty. So back in the 900s, the emperor made his courtiers wear this hat so they couldn't, cozy up in corners and conspire. So it's a nice bit of innovation. It's low tech, and it's also coupled with a lesson in history, which is really nice. You may have seen this quite recently. It's not just in China. So a few days ago, I heard about this cafe in Germany asking its customers to wear those noodle hats to ensure social distancing. And so back in the UK, so this is one of my pictures. I went to get some milk from a nearby farm with a friend of mine, and this is what was used to keep our social distance. So the payment pin pads are essentially sellotaped to a plank of wood to ensure we keep our distance. So low-tech hack, but it works. And moving up the spectrum of design and solution complexity and sophistication, we're also seeing example in Finland, so that's the one on the left-hand side. In one of the stores there, they've installed elbow handles. And on the right is an example from the UK, where a solution where you use your feet to open doors. So quite, all very ingenious, with fairly good affordance, still quite low tech. And my next example, and I'm not convinced whether this will catch on just yet in our parts of the world, or whether you could actually call this fashion. But in Asia, we're seeing a few online shops selling these stylish hats. And you essentially wear this to avoid contamination from droplets. But I also imagine that it stops you from touching your face. And moving up the spectrum to a more high-tech focused solution. So this example that you see is one that we saw in March from a company that produces point-of-sale kiosks based in the Netherlands. So imagine a point-of-sale kiosk, all touch-based, and essentially you can kind of press on the Guinness label to order your Guinness or Guinness-related products. And they essentially converted what was a touchscreen to a touchless interface that is governed by gesture. So you can wave your hand in the air and order without having to touch anything. And the final example of signals that things are changing is from China. So back in March again, we saw the rise of holographic lift buttons. So using a hologram instead of touching buttons. You're not actually touching anything. The hologram itself has virtual buttons. So it sounds a little bit like science fiction. But all this to say that all around the world, we're seeing new approaches to dealing with a specific issue. And that issue is hygiene. So this pandemic is there to stay, and it's not a one-off thing, and it's not short-lived. We are seeing new behaviors around washing hands and staying away from others and moving out of the way when you're walking down the street. And the behaviors that we're seeing are being reinforced by the government, by yourself, and also by the community around you. So a behavior that is reinforced over a period of time is likely to become a habit. So let's talk a little bit more about the behavioral psychology behind habit formation. So essentially, if we look at what is a habit, if you break it down, it's a non-conscious process that is picked up through repetition and reward. And that reward can be a good or bad, a bad thing. So I'm going to talk to you about a famous experiment of the 20th century that had a big impact on understanding behaviors and the science behind habit formation. So example is from the Skinner box. So this experiment carried out by B.F. Skinner furthered our understanding of conditioning. So you've got an illustration of the box there on screen. You place a hungry rat in the Skinner box. The box contains a lever on the side, and as the rat moves about the box, it would accidentally knock the lever. And immediately after it did so, a food pellet would drop into a container next to the lever. So the rats quickly learned to go straight to the lever after a few times of being put in the box. So the consequence of receiving the food, if they pressed the lever, ensured that they would repeat the action again and again. And they then stopped giving them the food until another trigger was present, so light or sound. And the rat then had to relearn to only press the lever when the trigger was present, when the light or the sound was played. So if we deconstruct the pattern, deconstruct the behavior and break it down, you have essentially a trigger, that's light or sound, that prompts the behavior of pressing the lever, which leads to the reward. In other words, if you start to associate a stimulus or a cue with a reward enough times, you'll create that link between those two things, and the behavior will be reinforced. So how does that apply to our public touchpoint scenario? Well, the trigger here is seeing a public touchpoint. You start to feel aversion, and you either avoid the touchpoint altogether, or if you can't, if you have to touch, you then make sure that you wash your hands after touch, or you use hand gel. And with either of those behaviors, the reward is a reduced amount of stress. Essentially, what I'm saying to you is that we are being conditioned to not want to touch things. And behaviors that help us complete tasks faster, or in ways that are more satisfying, or as in this case, reduce the amount of stress we experience, are going to be remembered. And after plenty of repetition, they become habits. And no matter what, by the time we're out of this pandemic, there would have been enough time to create a habit of distrust. So we're all learning to work remotely, but it's not just, it's not just our working practices that are changing. It's also our way of interacting with the world. So where are we now? I'm going to talk about numbers a little bit. As I mentioned earlier on, we ran a couple of surveys in April, so I'm going to talk to you about the findings now. So we did a survey with 2,000 adults in the UK in April. We wanted to find out, we wanted to look at how people would change the way that they use technology in the light of the pandemic or not. So we found out that almost 3/4 said they had either worn gloves or wiped down a public touch surface in the previous 2 weeks. We also found out that in future, almost half said they would use contactless payment more, obviously where the limit allows. 1/4 said they would use cash machines less and only when absolutely necessary. And 1/5 said they will do more online grocery shopping. So the intentions to change the way we interact with public touchpoints are certainly there. But obviously we know as researchers that what you say you will do isn't necessarily what you will do. I've run hundreds or thousands, actually, probably hours of research, and the number of times I've heard someone explaining to me what they were doing only to find them doing something else when I observe them carrying the task. That is also part of the reasons why I favor ethnography and research in context, so I can kind of take care of that bias. So obviously we are conscious of that, and we're also conscious that this study was recording an attitude, and an attitude does not necessarily equate to behavior. However, if you start to combine the signals of change and what we know about behavioral psychology of creating new habits and our research findings, we can draw an informed, educated guess that hygiene needs to be a significant consideration in product and service design around touchpoints. and that service providers that are taking this into consideration will be ahead of the game. I mean, there's also the question of negative brand associations. So if consumers are given little alternative but to interact using an ATM or a gas station kiosk when they don't feel comfortable doing so, how will that affect their perception of the brand that requires them to do this? From our research, it also became clear that touchless technology was the direction we were heading anyway. And there are multiple examples of touchless technology out there, but I just kind of picked a couple that were of interest. So this example from Ultraleap, doing mid-air haptics, virtual touch, essentially using ultrasound to create a sensation of touch in mid-air. So you're not actually touching anything. And most cases I've seen this applied in this uses virtual reality. So that's one example. Glamos here, using LiDAR technology. So that's light in the form of a pulsed laser to remotely sense where your hand is and essentially create a virtual touchscreen anywhere. So Glamos are a startup and they haven't got full funding yet, but they've got a working prototype, which looks really promising. And the other example there are kind of phone interfaces to ATM. This is essentially kind of using your phone to interact with the ATM, using your phone to get money out. And we're seeing this kind of ability being made more and more common. So, and if we look at from a financial point of view, so looking at size of market, so actually Markets and Markets published a report in April, and it showed that gesture recognition, the gesture recognition market is to triple in size in just 5 years, and the touchless sensing market is going to more than double. And this report covered APAC, North America, Europe, you know, the rest of the world. So I mean, one thing that's interesting as well is that these figures that I'm showing you here are pre-COVID. So I wonder what their predictions will be now. If you're familiar with the Future 100 trends, you know that they publish their report every year in January. Well, they had to actually republish this year in April. And the trend that was amended in that report is one that you see on your screen. So one thing that stands out is that, as you can see, people will seek designs and services that help them safeguard from germs. So it sounds like they're very much in agreement with us too. So touchless technology everywhere is tomorrow, but touchless technology is today. So the immediate challenge your customers want you to address is how to go about touching less technology. So unfortunately, we know that we've got some interesting times coming our way financially. We know that in times of recession, people prefer to stay indoors and kind of avoid to spend less money as possible on leisure and entertainment. But the good news is, you know, essentially best innovations tend to come out in times of privation, in times of crisis. So for example, both Amazon and Netflix spotted that staying indoors was more likely when there's a recession on. They spotted change in needs in their customers and they adapted accordingly. So back in 2008 when the crisis was on. So Netflix reviewed their model and provided people with more accessible TV and movie services. And Amazon essentially continued to innovate and launched the Kindle. And we started to see the rise of ebooks. And on Christmas Day 2009, essentially Amazon customers bought more ebooks than printed books. So yeah, two examples of how innovating in times of crisis is important. So how might we escape the tyranny of touch? Without a wholesale tech change, how might we help customers touch less technology? So we would recommend to consider intermediary hacks. And what do I mean by that? So if we haven't got the budgets to go fully touchless just yet, then think about midway solutions. So solutions that allow for catering for hygiene and are still within your immediate budget. And I've got a couple of examples, obviously. So first example, well, look at tear-off visors used in Formula One. So bear with me just a moment. So when you innovate, you sometimes look at things that are apparently completely unrelated to the area you want to innovate in, so as to get inspiration. So you can use those tear-off films on the road or to help prevent damage to the visor from like flying stones, and to help keep it clean and to also get clearer vision quickly. You just kind of tear off the film from the visor. And when I say clean, it's not for hygienic purposes that those tear-off visors are around. It's they're there. But is there something in that idea that you could put a film on a touch point and allow for the film to be removed by the person using it prior to use? I don't know. What you could also do is review the amount of interaction your customers have with public touch points to minimize that interaction. So going from something that I would say is high touch to a lower touch requirement. So in the example here on the left-hand side, it's what most self-service checkout journeys look like. And you've got to do quite a few taps to get to the moment where you actually pay. And if you've got an expensive shop, you can't pay contactless, so you even have to interact with the PIN pad and so on and so forth. On the right-hand side, you've got an example of an optimized journey with a reduced amount of touch to illustrate this idea of reviewing experiences to reduce the kind of touch requirements. There are all sorts of ideas that we could see emerge, and our money at Fullproof is on our phones. So in our initial survey, we saw that 7 out of 10 people would prefer to use their phone to interact with a touchscreen. You can control how clean or how dirty they are. We know how to use them. They're completely within our control. So there's no damaged trust, to go back to the concept that I mentioned at the start. So after we completed our research, completed the surveys, we set out to kind of create something concrete about it. We took it to the next level, still within the R&D squad, and we essentially came up with 2 different concepts in 2 different contexts where we currently touch a lot of things. So one is the context of supermarket, and the other is entering a building. So I'm going to just take you through the concepts that we came up with. So we imagined how we could help customers pay for their shopping in store without the need to handle store devices or interact with cashiers. And yeah, we recognize that some supermarkets already have, zappers and apps to scan as you shop, but the adoption rate for those is quite low. And it's because they still present quite a lot of friction. So you need to download an app, you need to scan and bag as you go, and it's not always practical to do so. So the concept that I'm going to kind of go through in a bit more detail is a universal browser-based solution. So no need to download an app. Solution requires, from the user's point of view, a smartphone, and also requires a QR code. But essentially, this solution enables customers to shop in a way that's familiar to them. So gathering, scanning, paying, enables them to check out faster through multiple scanning of barcodes, and I'll show you that in a second. And it's a white label solution, so it can be implemented by any store. So imagine that you scan this QR code, you go into the supermarket, you do your shopping, you gather your items, put your items, pick up all of your items in store as normal, and you get to the checkout area, and there's no need for the till anymore. So you just put all of your items together with barcodes visible and you scan them in one go. And if you've got a really big shop, you might have to do that in 2 lots. But essentially it allows you to scan multiple items in one go, and then you can select the payment method and you can essentially get your receipt. And this is it, you're pretty much done. So that's the first concept around touchless shopping. And the second concept is around touch-free access to buildings. So we've designed a world where you don't need to touch buttons to enter building and operate lifts. So the solution we've put together also requires, smartphone and QR codes. And equally, there's no need to download an app. So you're using a universal browser-based solution. And you don't need to check in with the building's reception, no need for like physical passes. You can essentially navigate around the building within the area that you are allowed in. So obviously security is a concern around this. So just imagine that you're scanning your barcode at the entrance of the building, and then you're presented with a list of who you might be able to see in terms of the companies, and you select Fullproof there. You might then be asked to kind of enter your name to authenticate you, and then you can confirm your access, and then you're presenting with a visitor's pass that you see on your screen. The visitor's pass is a QR code, and you go to the lift and you can scan that QR code, and then you can essentially be directed to where you need to be. So you can even augment that with a map view to navigate around the building. Okay, so I've hopefully given you some food for thoughts, but I guess what should you do about this? Well, research in leading European firms during the 2008 financial crisis showed that essentially increasing R&D investment will lead to, you'll drive faster recovery, higher firm survival rates, and increase your market capitalization. So now is not the time to cut spending on innovation. And brands which are catering for new emerging needs will win consumer favor. We need to consider hygiene when designing products, and the customer needs to feel safe from germs when interacting with those products. And we need to see hygiene as the new hygiene factor. So that is it. So Rob, I'll quickly now hand over to you to tell me to go through any kind of questions we may have.
Thank you, Isabel. That was great. Thank you. There's none currently in the chat at the moment, but if anybody wants to unmute themselves and pop their video on and ask a question to Isabel, we have a couple of minutes or a few minutes now to do that. Feel free. Please go ahead. So we have Isabel, can you see the chat? Do you want me to read that one out?
Oh yeah, from Saya.
Yes.
You mentioned phone. How about wearable techs like watch? Yeah, I mean, essentially, the wearable tech might still be a good hack because it's still something that is close to you. You can still essentially kind of, you're in control of the hygiene of the tech. So yeah, that might also be a very good hack to consider. Thank you for that question. Yeah, and then how would you manage security concerns with those two products? Well, so building, it depends which security concerns you were talking about, but essentially in the kind of like the kind of scenario where you're entering a building, you'll still have to kind of integrate with the kind of the management of the people entering the building. So there'll still need to be a list of people that you'd authenticate against. So it's not like we would be allowing entering the building without that kind of verification in place. It would just be done, it would just be automated. And in terms of the kind of the checkout experience, you'd probably need to have some spot checks in place first. So that might be a consideration, just to make sure that people are doing this in the right way. And there might be there might be like a 2 strikes and then you're out kind of thing, or 3 strikes and then you're out. There'd be a period of of adaptation for people to understand the concept, but essentially over time we would see that kind of probably being less and less of a concern. So how do you think all of this will affect gyms, which are essentially high-touch environments? Can't lift a weight without touching it. Our hands-free solution at the moment is online workouts, but we still have physical gym spaces. We already have hospital-grade cleaning practices. Disposable gloves would be expensive, ecologically unsound, and probably unpleasant to wear when you're sweating. Also, without proper training, they can be unreliable. Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point, and a very interesting area to kind of have to contend with in terms of like the challenges around that. Could there, I mean, like, you know, I mentioned the tear-off visor. Could there be something around that where essentially, as well as providing kind of stations where you can do your own cleaning, could we have a film that you can kind of tear off from those machines? The gym aspect is a very kind of challenging area, but there might be some innovations around that. So it'd be good to kind of put your heads together and try and kind of come up with what those might be. Any concern about touching goods like fruits coming from Spain, packaged goods coming from China, expressed in the survey? So the survey itself wasn't necessarily, it did have some free text options, but it was preset. So essentially you'd be selecting options from a set of already preset answers. And in the free text options, there was no specific kind of concerns around touching fruits from Spain or packaged goods, not to my awareness. Okay, so from Richard, can you see one interoperable system for touchless scan, shop and payments tech across retail and hospitality, or several providers? I mean, it's actually something that we've thought about. We think that we need to think more and more in terms of ecosystems. We need to think about things, we need to be work with the various kind of parts and work together to essentially come up with these solutions. Because I think it's no longer the case that we can work in isolation and just look at one segment or one silo of the experience. We need to think about the overall end-to-end experience and have that kind of interoperable system in place. So yes, I think this is the future. Nice research, thank you. While World will be looking at touchless technology, what are the disadvantages and cons of this technology? Well, I alluded to this a little bit in the deck that I've taken you through. But what I would say is, it's essentially, it's around the cost. So can we actually, can we implement that technology right now? Well, some people have already done that and they're ahead of the game. But essentially kind of looking at implementing touchless technology now as a reaction would be quite costly. So if you've already thought about it ahead, then you're already ahead of the game on that side. The other con is that some of those technologies are not necessarily as ahead as they could be. I've heard recently that the motion sensor in Google Pixel is going to be completely dropped. It's not necessarily because it's not as ahead as it could be, but it's because there wasn't really a use case for using gesture on that phone. So while it made a big bang last year when the Pixel came out, I think it was like 2 or 3 days ago, they said, well, in our next instance of the Pixel, we're just going to drop it altogether. Open system will be key to interoperability, not Tesco tech, Walmart tech. Yes, completely agree with you there, Don. So working together, we can't just kind of look at our own brands. We need to kind of like look broader than that.
Great. I think that's everyone. Thank you, Isabel, and thank you everyone for joining. That was a really great session. I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you all for your time and have a lovely rest of your Friday.
If anybody wants to has any follow-up questions, let me just put those details on screen, and please feel free to get in touch with me directly, and I'll try and answer all of your questions. But thank you very much.